Raz, the director of the MA program in Rockets and Geoscience Studies here at Stockton. And I'm very happy and grateful to introduce today Dr. Maha Nassar. So, as I said, it's a privilege to have Dr. Nassar with us here at Stockton. Thank you for coming. Dr. Nassar is an associate professor in the School of Middle Eastern and North African Studies at the University of Arizona, where she specializes in the cultural and intellectual history of the modern Arab world. She holds a PhD in Near Eastern languages and civilizations from the University of Chicago. Her book, shortlisted for the 2018 Palestine Book Awards, titled Brothers Apart, Palestinian Citizens of Israel and the Arab World, published by Stanford University Press last year. Dr. Nassar examines in it how Palestinians and intellectuals in Israel have connected to global decolonization movements and struggles through literary and journalistic writings, for scholarly articles that appeared in the Journal of Palestine Studies, Arab Studies Journal, and the Middle East Journal of Culture and Communication. Dr. Nassar is also a 2018 Public Voices Fellow with the GAZA Project and a policy member of El-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network, and is spending this year at Princeton. Her analysis and opinion pieces have appeared in the Washington Post, The Forward, The Hill, and elsewhere. As I said, I'm very happy to have you with us at Stockton, Dr. Nassar, and very much looking forward to that lecture discussion. So,
thank you, Dr. Siegel, for inviting me, and thank you all for coming out. It's a packed room, which as a professor, I always like to see a full house. So thank you guys all for coming out this afternoon. I'm especially excited to speak to so many undergraduate students and graduate students out there as well, because in many ways the seeds of this project began when I was an undergrad student many years ago. So I'll go ahead and get started, and I'll just dive in. So in recent years, social justice work has undertaken a transnational turn, with growing interest in the interconnectedness of struggles around the world. We saw a powerful example of this in 2014, in the summer of 2014, when social justice activists noticed striking similarities in the use of state violence against Black American protesters in Ferguson, Missouri, and against Palestinians in the Gaza Strip at the same time. In addition, several Palestinian Americans went to Ferguson to join in the protests, highlighting the analogies between the conditions in the occupied Palestinian territories and in America's inner cities. That summer also saw the rise of the hashtag #PalestineFerguson, where Palestinians in the occupied territories sent messages of support and tweets to protesters in Missouri with advice about how to deal with armored tanks, curfews, tear gas, and other forms of militarized policing. The events in Ferguson and Gaza point to the growing transnational movement of solidarity between Black Americans and Palestinians that has developed over the last few years to push back against dispossession and state violence, exclusionary nationalism, as well as exclusionary nationalism in both contexts. Groups like Black Solidarity with Palestine, which seek to raise awareness of these issues and the interconnectedness, is but one example. These transnational movements come at a time when scholars have also been taking a closer look at how Black Palestinians historically have compared their struggle for freedom to similar struggles elsewhere in the world. In particular, scholarship by Professors Sohaib Balotzai, Alice Lubin, and Keith Feldman have all illuminated quite eloquently the ways in which Black intellectuals in America have viewed the Palestinian struggle for liberation as part of a broader shared struggle against racialized structures of oppression. To So today I'd like to share with you some of my findings about what is in some ways the mirror image of their respective projects. That is, I'll be discussing how Palestinians have understood their conditions and their struggles in relationship to the Black American freedom movement. My talk today is divided into 3 parts. First, I'll show how different groups of Palestinians from the 1960s to today have drawn on various streams of Black American thought, including leftist, anti-colonial, and anti-racist discourses, as well as calls for nonviolence and assertions of cultural pride. Then I'll discuss 2 key challenges that both Palestinians and Black Americans face in their quest for social justice. And finally, I'll conclude by pointing out a few ways in which, some lessons that social justice activists and scholars can learn from these shared experiences. So let me begin by saying a little bit about my own connection to this topic. As a Palestinian American Muslim undergraduate student in the mid-90s, attending a small suburban liberal arts college, there wasn't much in the way of campus activism. I was the only Palestinian student, and then I became one of 2. And with the Oslo talks underway at the time, everyone thought that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was easy peasy, on its way to resolution. I was active in my college's Muslim Student Association, which was mostly engaged in cultural awareness and interfaith work. But there wasn't much in the way of social justice happening around me. Now, I did major in English language and literature, and looking back on it now, I realized that I had been particularly interested in Black American writers of the 20th century. Writers like Langston Hughes, County Cohen, W.E.B. Du Bois, Alice Walker, and Amiri Baraka. Reading their poems and essays and novels, I found that I identified deeply with their quest to humanize their own people in the face of massive systems of dehumanization and oppression. And I also came to recognize the powerful role that the written word can play in the pursuit of justice. By my senior year of college, I had decided to switch gears, or so I thought at the time, and instead pursue graduate work in Middle East Studies with a focus on Palestinian history. My grad school days at the University of Chicago, on the south side of Chicago, coincided with the outbreak of the Second Intifada, which mobilized social justice activists to draw attention to those Palestinians who were still under occupation in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. For my dissertation, I chose to focus on a relatively understudied group of Palestinians, those who, in 1948, were not expelled from their country, but instead were incorporated into the new Israeli state. Most of these 160,000 Palestinians were granted Israeli citizenship in 1952, and while Israeli officials touted their presence as evidence of Israel's professed democratic standing, their position was clearly that of second-class citizens. Unlike their Jewish counterparts, Palestinian citizens of Israel were placed under tight control through a military government, subject to frequent land confiscations, and punished for any political activity deemed a security threat. Now, rather than delve into the Israeli state archives, the most common place historians go to study this group, I turned instead to the writings of these Palestinian citizens of Israel, looking at books, newspapers, journals, and especially poetry. As I read pieces by Arabic writers, such as Amir Habibi, Mahmoud Darwish, and Samir Qasim, all of whom held Israeli citizenship, I got a sense of deja vu. Many of the themes and images they explored echoed the very same ones I had read as an undergrad by Black American writers. They too sought to humanize the Palestinians and make visible their experiences in reaction to the invisibilization of their existence. Most of these writings appeared in the newspapers and magazines of the Israeli Communist Party, the ICP. As the only non-Zionist party that accepted Jews and Arabs as equal members, the ICP became the political home for many Palestinian activists in Israel. While some of them were indeed strong ideological Marxists, many others turned to the ICP's press outlets because they were the only ones in Israel that provided room for a sustained critique of Zionism and an assertion of Arab cultural pride. As with leftist parties all over the world, the ICP emphasized international solidarity. Its Arabic language newspaper, Al-Ittihad, covered anti-colonial struggles taking place in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, while its cultural journal, Al-Jadid, translated into Arabic the works of great realist and social realist writers such as Pushkin, Tolstoy, Lorca, and Neruda. I'll pause for a minute and talk a little bit about this headline since you're all reading it. So this is a headline from 1951. It's the part that I highlighted in highlighter. It was from February 10th, and the headline says, "The 7 American Negroes from Martinsville sentenced to the electric chair. As for Krupp and the Nazi generals, the Americans released them." Exclamation point. So the reference here is to the Martinsville 7 who were executed for allegedly raping a white woman, despite minimal evidence, or problematic evidence. Krupp was a German industrialist who had been tried and found guilty in an American tribunal for using slave labor during the Nazi Holocaust. And Nazi generals were also put on trial. And in 1951, several of them, including Krupp, were granted clemency. So that's what the headline is referencing. So you can tell the Cold War context is very prevalent in this, and the way that Ittihad got wind of what was happening was very much related to an international campaign that was waged by the NAACP and the CRC, Black American organizations that were trying to garner international support, particularly for the Martinsville 7. So I have on the one hand the headlines like this and news coverage, and then on the other hand I also have, in translation, I come across in Al-Ittihad al-Jadid, Arabic translations of works by Black American leftist writers, including Langston Hughes, Countee Cullen, W.E.B. Du Bois, Paul Robeson, and Richard Wright. So as I looked more closely, I found that Palestinian intellectuals and activists had a keen interest in the specific struggles of Black Americans throughout the 1950s and 60s. In addition to headlines like this one, Al-Ittihad ran stories about school desegregation in Little Rock, the scourge of lynchings in the Deep South, and the fortitude of civil rights activists who braved dogs and water cannons to push for their cause. Now, on the one hand, coverage of these events was not unique. As I mentioned, leftist parties and press outlets all over the world were following very closely what was happening as part of a larger Cold War contestation. Critics of the United States were portraying America as blighted by a trifecta of racism, economic exploitation, and imperial overreach. And so looking at what was happening to African Americans at the time was part of that larger picture. But on the other hand, Palestinian citizens of Israel had a unique connection to the Black freedom movement. Many of them saw direct parallels between the conditions of Black Americans living in the so-called Beacon of Liberty and their own conditions as Palestinian citizens of Israel living in the so-called only democracy in the Middle East. Palestinian children in Israel, like their Black American counterparts, attended segregated schools that were underfunded, overcrowded, and forced to teach a curriculum that was dismissive of their own culture and heritage. Palestinian citizens of Israel, like Black Americans, all too often found that even with a high school diploma and good test scores, their admission to college was blocked. Palestinian citizens of Israel, like their Black American counterparts, also all too often found themselves randomly stopped and questioned by police, taken in for questioning, detained, and jailed. Those who were politically active were all the more likely to be punished for what was deemed to be incitement, all while being told they should be grateful for living in such a vibrant democracy. So given all these striking parallels, Palestinian citizens and intellectuals in Israel didn't just consider the American civil rights movement to be merely interesting international news. They also drew upon the experiences and perspectives of Black Americans in order to help them make sense of the conditions under which they lived. To give you an example of this, Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish, many of you know him as a famous Palestinian poet, was actually a Palestinian citizen of Israel. And in the 1960s, he eloquently expressed his feelings of recognition with African Americans. In a 1966 essay titled Letter to a Negro, Darwish voiced his sense of camaraderie with Black American writers, who, in affirming their own humanity, affirmed him as well. Darwish wrote, quote, "When I read the book by your gifted writer, James Baldwin, Nobody Knows My Name, I felt as if James is writing about me personally, about the quote-unquote Negroes in Israel. with only slight adjustments to the details of the picture. When he wrote about love, he was narrating my love story. And when he wrote about hate, he reflected my hate. Darwish here expresses a deep sense of connection with the personal struggles that Baldwin, like many Black Americans, contended with. He also reveals the transnational impact of Baldwin's work, like the work of Langston Hughes and others, the impact that it had on Palestinians who found themselves treated as outsiders in their own land. To be sure, Darwish also acknowledges that the circumstances were not identical. He goes on to say, quote, "Truth be told, your condition is worse. We can enter cafes and schools and hug blonde women because our color is not as clearly distinctive as yours," end quote. In other words, Darwish is saying that the in-your-face segregation of the Jim Crow South was nowhere to be found in Israel. Yet more subtle and pernicious forms of racism were there nonetheless. Darwish's colleague and friend, poet and critic Salim Gibran, poignantly described an experience of this sort. He described how he was riding in a shared taxi near Jerusalem one day when it was stopped at a police checkpoint. Being the only Palestinian in the taxi, he was singled out for an ID check. As he grumbled under his breath, a passenger next to him demanded to know why he was upset, since it was merely a security measure. Gibran writes that he, somewhat sarcastically, replied, "Oh, it's nothing. I'm quite content. The position of us Arabs in this country is still better than the positions of the blacks in Rhodesia, and even better than the position of the Negroes in North America. The proof of this is that I am black, I travel with whites in a taxi, and I can even eat at the same restaurant, side by side with whites. It's better, of course, that I not speak Arabic or read an Arabic newspaper." Gibran's analogy here points to the ways in which Palestinian citizens of Israel understood the shared internal logic of racialized systems of oppression, even if those systems did not necessarily have identical external manifestations. While the system of oppression in 1960s Jim Crow South was explicitly predicated on racialized distinctions, in Israel the hierarchy was based more on ethno-linguistic identity, which to be sure overlapped with perceived racial markers, but was not the same, did not manifest the same way as it did in Jim Crow South. But either way, the constant reminder that you do not fully belong to a nation in which you are technically a citizen was a clear parallel that Gibran, like Darwish, felt with Black Americans. Moving ahead, by the late 60s, there was growing disappointment in many sectors of the Black community with a slow pace of reform. That, coupled with growing third world liberation movements, led a younger generation of Black American activists to analyze their condition not through the lens of civil rights, but rather through the lens of anti-colonialism. This was the rise of the Black Power movement, with groups such as SNCC and the Black Panthers, who increasingly articulated their struggles as part of a third world anti-colonial liberationist movement. At the same time, the June 1967 war, or the Six-Day War, in which Israeli forces occupied the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem, ushered in a new wave of nationalist activism among Palestinians in exile. In particular, militant groups such as Fatah concluded that, as with colonial situations elsewhere, revolutionary armed struggle was the only viable path towards liberation. The larger umbrella organization of Palestinians in exile, known as the PLO, also launched a diplomatic initiative in which they reached out to other anti-colonial groups to form coalitions at the political and cultural levels, and to highlight the similarities between their struggles for liberation and the struggles of other colonized people around the world. And so the poster that you see there on what on your right is a Fatah poster that says "Freedom is one," Hurriya Wahida, and you have a picture linking Palestine, the map of Palestine, map of Africa, with also you have hands linked together and a palm tree in between, and then holding up the torch of liberation. And so the idea of bringing together liberation movements in Africa as well as African Americans was also part of it. So the Pan-African dimension of this is something I can talk about maybe more in the Q&A. So with both the Black Power movement and the PLO situating their respective struggles within the logic of third world anti-colonialism, it wouldn't be long before they looked toward one another in solidarity and support. Arabic newspapers carried front-page banner headlines reporting on the 1968 urban uprisings 50 years ago that followed the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. Interesting, a lot of those Arab headlines termed those uprisings using the Arabic word for uprising, intifada. So you have headlines that say an intifada of American Negroes, using the term at the time, were taking place in major American cities. And so the connotation of that is very different from talking about race riots. We're talking about riots in general. The term of the use intifada gave it a political cachet that was recognized at the time by a Palestinian, in particular, Palestinian press. Both Palestinian nationalists and Black Power activists also took note of the powerful role that cultural productions, literature, art, music, etc., could play in bypassing the raw instruments of power wielded by the state. In particular, some Palestinian activists in the US looked for ways to explain the Palestinian cause to Black activists, who were themselves eager to learn more about it. One result was the 1970 English translation of Palestinian resistance poetry titled Enemy of the Sun, which you see up there, with poems by Darwish, along with other Palestinian poets such as Samih al-Qasim and Fadl Tuqan. The anthology spoke of the experiences of loss, exile, imprisonment, and exclusion. But it also spoke of hope, steadfastness, and optimism. Now, it was no coincidence that the book was published by the publishing arm of the Drum and Spear bookstore, a Washington, D.C.-based bookstore that was at the time a meeting place for Black artists and progressive political movers and shakers. In other words, it was a press that specialized in Black power and Black literature movement that provided the first English language translation of Palestinian poetry. So translating and publishing Palestinian resistance poetry in such a venue was one way in which Palestinians could continue the conversation with Black American writers that had begun in earlier years. The relationship between the Black Power movement and the Palestinian activists continued to flourish in the 1970s. When Black Power feminist Angela Davis was arrested in 1970, Palestinian women were part of the global Free Angela Davis campaign. And the letter, what you see up top there is actually showing right now. I took them myself a few weeks ago at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. And what you see there is a letter written by the Arab Women's League of Jordan, writing in support of Angela Davis on International Women's Day, March 8, 1971, saying that we recognize your struggle, we recognize the problem of political imprisonment all throughout the world. It's something that we're very familiar with, and we stand in solidarity with your unjust incarceration. So that was happening in 1970-71. 2 years later, at the 10th World Festival of Youth and Students, held under Soviet auspices in East Berlin in 1973, PLO Chairman Yasser Arafat, along with Davis and others, were presented in a ceremony celebrating their shared anti-colonial struggle. In addition, the Palestinian press covered Black Power figures, including Davis, Stokely Carmichael, and others, citing their analysis of the deep roots of violence in the American system. Now, aggressive crackdowns by the American police and FBI, coupled with internal strife, led to the dissolution of Black Panthers in 1982. That same year, the Israeli invasion and occupation of Beirut ousted the PLO from its headquarters in Lebanon and sent the leadership to distant Tunisia. And so it seemed at the time that Third World liberationist discourse shared by the PLO and Black Power movement was put out. But that did not mean that Palestinians had turned away from the lessons of the Black American struggle altogether. 1 year later, in 1983, a Palestinian named Mubarak Awad hosted a workshop in the West Bank town of Ramallah, where he taught attendees the principles of nonviolent resistance. Awad had gone to college in Ohio in the 1970s, where he had helped underserved communities acquire basic economic necessities. During that time, he also learned about the history of the Black freedom movement, and especially the principles of nonviolent resistance espoused by Dr. King. So upon returning to the West Bank, Awad sought to convince his fellow Palestinians that they too could apply the lessons of King to change their own conditions of living under occupation and harsh military rule. When the first Intifada broke out in December 1987, most international media coverage focused on images of teenage Palestinians with rocks and slingshots. But Palestinians under occupation also waged successful campaigns of civil disobedience. Tactics such as boycotts and protests were taken straight out of the pages of the civil rights movement. The first Intifada proved that the current situation of indefinite Israeli military occupation was unsustainable. But by the early 1990s, it was unclear what to do about it. Meanwhile, here in the US, 12 years of the Reagan and Bush administrations had had a devastating impact on communities of color. The self-proclaimed war on drugs led to a rise in incarceration rates, especially among Black men, and economic policies ravaged already underserved urban areas. Enter Bill Clinton. As he ran for president in 1992, Bill Clinton made a grand promise to Black voters. If they vote for him, he would improve their lives. The following year, in 1993, he made a similar promise to the Palestinians. If they trusted him to mediate direct Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, he'd improve the lives of Palestinians, or at least the ones under occupation. Both groups were to be disappointed. In the United States, the 8 years of the Clinton administration oversaw an even greater rise in mass incarceration, as well as neoliberal economic policies that increased the gap between rich and poor. Meanwhile, during the years of the so-called peace process, Palestinians were being told that they were no longer really under occupation. Instead, they were being ruled by a corrupt and despotic Palestinian authority that had only the veneer of independence. At the same time, the number of Israeli-only settlements increased, as did the land that was confiscated for those settlements. And checkpoints popped up through the territories, further hindering the mobility of Palestinians. Inside Israel itself, neoliberalization policies had a disproportionately negative impact on Palestinian areas. Drugs, crime, and underdevelopment increasingly plagued the so-called Arab towns in Israel. And so by the late 1990s, it looked like, once again, the struggles for justice had been set back. When the second Intifada broke out in 2000 over frustrations with the Clinton-mediated peace process, a younger generation of Palestinian Americans and their allies began mobilizing. Many were students who sought to provide context to the news headlines by highlighting the conditions that Palestinians were forced to live under. There was also a renewed push by Palestine solidarity activists to once again form alliances with other groups seeking political and economic justice. This included Black Americans who were organizing robust campaigns around prison reform and economic justice. Yet despite recognizing the importance of such alliance building, actual cooperation was uneven at this time. But over the last decade, several geopolitical and technological transformations have pushed Palestinians to reassess their relationship with Black American communities and to forge closer ties to them. In part, this is because there is a greater awareness that both Palestinians and Black Americans have a common set of challenges that they're both struggling against. And here I'll turn to some of those challenges. The first challenge is a political legal challenge, especially here in the US. The post-9/11 so-called war on terror was added to the war on drugs and the war on crime as disastrous policies that have disproportionately affected communities of color. One of the first nonprofit groups prosecuted under the Patriot Act was the Holy Land Foundation, which raised money in the US for Palestinian orphans. In addition, federal prosecutors went after Dr. Sami Al-Arian, a Palestinian-American university professor, accusing him of material support of terrorism. In both cases, juries failed to hand down any convictions. Yet in the case of Dr. Arian, he continued to be held for 2 more years under house arrest here in the US before being deported. These cases and many others led to a growing realization, particularly among the Palestinian community, that poorly written laws and selective enforcement of them can have a chilling effect on an entire community. addition, activists in both communities recognize that militarized policing in the U.S., and this is a picture from Ferguson, that militarized policing in the U.S., along with more invasive surveillance techniques, such as spying on mosques, and more intrusive policies, such as stop and frisk, can be traced back to methods pioneered by the Israeli security regime. Over the last decade, Israeli security firms have been training local American police forces at an alarming rate. This includes the St. Louis County Police Department and the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department, two of the 4 law enforcement agencies that were deployed in 2014 to Ferguson in order to quell the demonstrations that rose up after the killing of Michael Brown. Their militarized response to unarmed demonstrators, whose slogan was literally, "Hands up, don't shoot." Their militarized response was to shoot them with tear gas in scenes quite reminiscent of Israeli responses to Palestinian demonstrators. Because the developments of militarized policing in both the United States and Israel have been couched in the language of security, rather than in the language of race or ethnicity, the systems of oppression that we're facing are not as visible as they may have once been. This leads me to a second set of challenges that both Palestinians and Black Americans share, which is the discursive challenge. What I mean is that because these systems of oppression are no longer as obvious as before, what I call the language of progress often crowds out discussions of ongoing inequalities or injustices. We hear things like, "Well, we elected a Black president twice," or "Palestinians already have a president and a flag at the UN. What more do they want?" The danger of this language of progress is that it pathologizes Palestinians and Black Americans by implying that the problem is no longer with particular systems of oppression, but rather with themselves and their own communities. So we hear things about the alleged shortcomings, political, biological, cultural shortcomings of these communities as explainers for why we see such uneven development. A corollary to the language of progress is what I call the language of hatred. What I mean here is that since these systems of oppression are not as visible as they were in the past, and because Palestinians and Black Americans are already being blamed for their own conditions, when they seek to point out the ongoing and pernicious, if more subtle, forms of oppression, their calls for justice gets labeled as hatred. As in, why do you hate white people? Why are you anti-Semitic? And when they point out that they don't hate anyone or any particular group of people, but rather have a deep-seated revulsion to injustice, the reply is, "Okay, fine. Why do you have to be so angry about it?" And so these discursive challenges, the language of progress and the language of hatred, become enmeshed in a circular logic that can be very difficult to break. This is especially true given the stereotypes that are already embedded in mainstream Western media about both of these groups supposedly being angry all the time, and apparently for no good reason. So given this history that I've described earlier, and given the ongoing challenges that both groups face today, what lessons can social justice activists and scholars learn, and how can we apply them today? So I'd like to offer the beginnings of 3 lessons. The first is that cross-cultural influences are continuing today, and they can continue to inform and shape the ways in which these communities understand each other. As happened when Darwish read Baldwin, more recently Palestinians have also felt a deep connection with Black American culture, in particular with hip-hop and political rap that came out of American cities. This is especially true for Palestinian citizens of Israel, who face many of the same issues of crime, drugs, and police brutality that their counterparts in America face. One of the first and perhaps foremost, and perhaps most famous, hip-hop group in the Arab world today is DAM, which was founded by Palestinian citizens of Israel. In explaining his influences, DAM founder Maha Nassar, who's in the middle there, cited Tupac's All Eyes on Me, along with the Fugees, DMX, Nas, Mos Def, and especially Public Enemy's Fear of a Black Planet as influencing his own work. But he was also influenced by the works of great Palestinian writers like Darwish, Hassan Kanafani, and Najib Ali. Dam's ability to merge these 2 distinct yet overlapping sets of cultural production has in turn influenced a new generation of Palestinian and Arab hip-hop artists, like Maha Nassar on the right there, and many others. This fusion of East and West illustrates how Black American culture continues to shape how Palestinians define their own experiences, and highlighting these connections can deepen our understanding of the shared challenges they face. Second lesson is that while it's important to draw attention to the systems of repression that each community faces, we should remain vigilant about centering Black and Palestinian experiences in our analyses. Let me give you one brief example of what I'm talking about. Shortly after her upset primary victory this past summer, progressive congressional candidate Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was asked in an interview about a tweet that she had written in May, in which she used the term massacre to describe Israel's killing of some 60 Palestinian protesters in Gaza on May 15. Ocasio-Cortez replied, quote, "For me, the lens through which I saw this incident as an activist, as an organizer, if 60 people were killed in Ferguson, Missouri, if 60 people were killed in the South Bronx, unarmed, if 60 people were killed in Puerto Rico, it would just be completely unacceptable if that happened on our shores," unquote. When the reviewer pushed back by saying, quote, "But the war in the Middle East is very different than people expressing their First Amendment right to protest," unquote, Ocasio-Cortez conceded the point, affirmed Israel's right to exist, and started talking vaguely about two-state solutions and human rights. When pushed further, she demurred, saying she wasn't an expert in the matter. Now, Ocasio-Cortez began her answer with a powerful affirmation of the shared experiences that I've described today, that of Black and Palestinian unarmed protesters being killed through state violence, whether in Gaza or Ferguson or elsewhere. But she got sidetracked into talking about geopolitics, which she was unprepared to do. And this often happens to social justice activists, particularly those who deal with Palestine. To be sure, there are a lot of geopolitical complexities. But had she stuck with her original line of argument that unarmed protesters shouldn't be killed, period, she would have made her point more forcefully and would not have gotten sidetracked. This brings me to a third lesson that I think we can learn, which is the importance of linking the local and the global in our calls for social justice. In recent years, progressives have largely ceded the discussion of foreign policy to liberal interventionists and neoconservatives, both of whose policies have created more misery and instability in the region. A welcome change has come through the Movement for Black Lives platform, which deftly links foreign and domestic policy. Especially noteworthy is the platform's call, which you can find in the Invest Divest section, the call for, quote, "a cut in military expenditures and a reallocation of those funds to invest in domestic infrastructure and community well-being," unquote. In terms specifically of Palestine, the platform goes on to explain, quote, "The U.S. requires Israel to use 75% of all the military aid it receives to buy U.S.-made arms," unquote. And then it goes on to explain, quote, "This not only diverts much-needed funding from domestic education and social programs, but it makes U.S. citizens complicit in the abuses committed by the Israeli government," unquote. So by linking U.S. military aid to Israel to the lack of investment in their own communities, the Movement for Black Lives makes a powerful case for looking beyond national borders to achieve social justice, and indeed makes the case that you have to look beyond national borders to truly achieve social justice. Now, unfortunately, we don't yet have a Palestinian equivalent for the kind of comprehensive policy platform offered by the Movement for Black Lives. This is due to a number of reasons, including physical fragmentation across dozens of countries, as well as the political challenges in the form of a co-opted and corrupt leadership. But I do hope that in the future it will become another source of inspiration for the Palestinian people. So to conclude, today I've laid out some of the ways in which different groups of Palestinians have, over the last half-century, drawn on various streams of Black American thought to help them articulate their own conditions under multiple structures of oppression. And I've also laid out some of the political, legal, and structural challenges, as well as discursive challenges, that both groups face. and some of the lessons that we can learn from their respective struggles. Now, I don't wish to romanticize or sentimentalize this history. There have been and continue to be ongoing cleavages between these groups. And to be sure, the systems of oppression that both communities face continue to manifest in very different ways. But as Angela Davis reminds us, she writes, quote, "Freedom is a constant struggle," unquote. And so overall, I'm optimistic that in the long term, as coalitions continue to build, as younger generations continue to build, to rise up and to build a network, that they'll be joined by people of goodwill from all races and ethnicities who will hopefully one day come to see the day when there will truly be liberty and justice for all. Thank you very much.